Welcome to the New Books Network.
My name is Maria Lipman, and I'm talking today to Mia Nakachi, the author of Replacing the Dead, The Politics of Reproduction in the Post-War Soviet Union, published by Oxford University Press in 2021. Hi, Mia, and thank you for agreeing to talk with me.
Hi, Masha. Thank you so much for your invitation. Very happy to be here.
So the issue of reproductive policy, the topic of your book, has gained critical urgency in today's Russia. Here's from a Russian online publication dated November 26. We're talking on December 5, so very recently. Here's a quote. Starting in 2025, the presidential administration will begin evaluating the effectiveness of governors based on the birth rate in their regions. A source close to the Kremlin administration is quoted as saying that birth rates in large families are the main concerns of the president. This is a quote. And this message is being, another quote, transmitted to the regions. Another source explained that Russian officials make sure that the issue of birth rate is brought up as often as possible so the Kremlin would see that you're on board. Another example of reproductive policy, if you like, put governors in charge of the birth rates in their regions. Putin and his government have aggressively pushed a pronatalist policy. And as you demonstrate in your book, this trend is all too familiar from the Soviet decades. So to begin with, please say a few words about your general topic, your sources, your time frame, and of course, why you picked this topic for your work, for your book.
Yes. So during World War II, the Soviet Union lost 27 million of its population, which is by far the biggest loss among the belligerent countries in the world. And back then, Soviet leaders looked at this as a threat to its economic reconstruction after the war, also reconstruction of its military. So they introduced an extreme pronatalist policy in 1944 in the form of a family law. And so my book is about how the leadership developed this extreme pronatalist policy, how they implemented it, and also how this policy affected reproductive lives of its citizens, especially women. I also examined the role of medical and legal professionals, as well as demographers, who were also involved in designing this policy and implementation of this policy. And they also evaluated the impact of this policy on women's lives. And for this study, as a historian, I used a lot of archival materials. Many materials came from the Ministry of Health and Justice archives, also archive of economy, party archives at the central and local levels. So I traveled around Russia to collect various materials. I also conducted interviews, about a dozen interviews, with women who, most of whom had experience of abortions in the post-war period. And in addition, I interviewed several medical professionals who practiced medicine in the post-war period. And of course, I used secondary sources as well. I read journals, magazines, newspapers, and etc. Saw some films which depicted women's lives in the post-war period in the Soviet Union. And the main period of my research was between 1944, when this pronatalist policy was developed and introduced until 1955, when the Soviet Union re-legalized abortion. So this was the main 11 years or so of my research. But my final chapter in this book also looks at the development after the re-legalization of abortion in 1955 through the end of the Soviet Union. And the epilogue looks at the post-Soviet period.
Yes, indeed. And the post-Soviet period, and as we speak, this issue is becoming more and more relevant and urgent by the day. Now, would you please speak about what actually preceded the 1944 law? And actually, of course, you mentioned the horrendous losses that the Soviet Union suffered during World War II. However, it is also important, not only in terms of the number itself, but the disproportion between men and women. So would you please mention that? Of course, it's natural that it's primarily men who are killed in the war, but the actual numbers, I think it is worthwhile to mention it from the start, so that as this policy may be somehow understood, if not justified.
Right, absolutely, yes. One very important problem of this loss of the population was that 20 of the 27 million loss was male, which meant that in post-war society, there will be much, much fewer men than women. And this very unbalanced sex ratio was particularly present in the Western regions of the Soviet Union. And the most affected region of Russia back then was in Smolensk region, where the sex ratio was for 19 men, you had 100 women. So this was the worst. That was the state in the beginning of 1944. And on average, though, for the whole Soviet Union, the ratio didn't look so bad, not as bad as what we saw in Smolensk region. It was for 3 men, you had 4 women. So this didn't look as dire as the situation in the western part of the Soviet Union.
Yes, we will get to that, but I will repeat my question. So let's go back a little bit and talk about the reproductive policy of the pre-war Soviet Union. And actually, it seems, Vladimir Lenin himself who passed an act that had to do with this policy. Can you please talk about that?
Yes. Actually, the Soviet Union became the first country in the world to legalize abortion in 1920. And not only did it legalize, it made abortion safe, clinical abortion for free and on demand. And of course, this was a very extremely progressive policy at the time. Especially considering how all major Western nations, whichever legalized abortion, they did so in the 1960s and 1970s. Yeah, so the Soviet Union was ahead by half a century, essentially.
Indeed. However, it seems that the rationale that Vladimir Lenin, in his decree, was guided by was not the same by far as the rationale that was driving pro-abortion or pro-right movement in the West later on. So would you please speak about that? Why at the actually in a country devastated by the revolution and the Civil War, Lenin decided that this was an important measure to legalize abortion?
So this legalization of abortion in 1920 was not in support of reproductive rights of women, as you pointed out. So the main reason was public health. New Soviet leaders, Bolshevik leaders, considered abortion still an evil practice. However, they understood that criminalization of abortion only was driving women into the underground abortion, where many women damaged their health. And they considered this more problematic. And because of that, they decided to provide safe, legalized abortion.
So it was a modernization measure, like one of so many modernization measures and modernization reforms introduced in the early Soviet Union. Would you agree with that?
Yes, well, one could, yes, use that term, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very progressive idea, but really the main concern was the health. Yes, health of women, protecting women's health. And this is something that is very relevant to today's situation in the United States, it seems, as well. Once women lost the constitutional right to abortion in various states where abortion is not easily available, women who really want to have children but have some health issues were having troubles, and some of them had died.
Indeed. This is what makes your topic and our conversation today, I think, relevant for the situation in the United States as well.
Mm-hmm.
So how long did that, let's call it modernizing reform, how long did it last? So it was the decree, Lenin's decree legalizing abortion was issued in 1920. If I'm not mistaken. So what happened next? How long were Soviet women actually allowed to have an abortion on demand?
It was until 1936 when a new family law criminalized abortion.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, how did that happen and why? What was the rationale then? So the way you describe it, Russia, Soviet Russia, the new Soviet Union was, of course, 1920 was before the Soviet Union was
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's
founded.
yes.
But Soviet Russia was the most progressive in a way by actually offering abortion on demand. What happened in 1936 and why did that change?
Yes, the major reason that this happened was because of Joseph Stalin's policies that he introduced in early 1930s. So in 1920, as you mentioned, the first leader of this revolutionary Russia was Vladimir Lenin. And he passed away. And then the next leader came in towards the late 1920s, and that was Joseph Stalin. And he introduced two measures that had big impact on the population, especially the birth rate. And those two policies were, one, industrialization, rapid industrialization of society, and also collectivization, where peasants were forced to give up their private farming and their equipment to join the reorganized collective farms. And both of those policies had a negative impact on the birth rate, not surprisingly, because what we see a number of times when industrialization happens, workers come from the villages and they move to urban areas and start working in factories, and they start forming families that are very different from the kinds of families they would have formed in back in the villages, and they start having fewer children. So birth rate, generally speaking, goes down as a result of industrialization and urbanization of society. So that was happening in early 1930s in the Soviet Union. And collectivization, this process of forcing peasants to give up their traditional farming, and during which the so-called rich peasants who owned more farm and equipment were driven out by force. So it created big chaos in agricultural regions, and that actually led to a big scale of famine, the so-called Great Famine in 1932 to 33, where millions of people starved to death. And that, of course, had a big impact, negative impact on the level of population and also the birth rate. So Stalin was seeing the reduced number of population by the millions and also declining birth rate. And his answer was to criminalize abortion in the hope of seeing a higher birth rate.
Yeah, so it was, in a way, a pro-natalist measure, right? This was the first in the history of the Soviet Union. This was probably the first radical pro-natalist policy.
Exactly.
And what happened between actually 36 and the law in 1944 that you mentioned earlier, and now we get to the period of the focus of your work?
Well, a lot of things happened. Of course, there was the Great Patriotic War, World War II in Russia. But in terms of the consequences of the 1936 law, the impact of that criminalization on fertility, only for the first year in 1937, there was a slight increase in the number of births, but that was the only year. For the following years, the number of births continued to decline. So the impact of the criminalization was not the kind that was expected or hoped by the leadership, in particular Stalin. But then the Soviet Union started going into war already in 1939. So we are talking about having data only for several years in the late 30s. So it's the impact of the criminalization cannot be really assessed fully because the war began very quickly after the introduction of the legislation.
Yes, and so here we get to the period that your research is devoted to, right? 44, the so-called family law, the environment that you have already described, gigantic, horrendous losses, the disproportion between men and women. So what is the policy that the Soviet Union adopted in 1944, and who actually masterminded it?
Yes. So the law which was adopted was originally created in Kiev and masterminded by the leader of Soviet Ukraine at that time, Nikita Khrushchev. And he was the one who wrote up a proposal for this law. And the most striking element of this pronatalist law, which was introduced by Khrushchev, was the idea of encouraging unmarried women to reproduce as a way of accelerating post-war birth rate.
Now, how was that actually masterminded? How do you encourage unmarried women to give birth?
Yes, well, we already mentioned that there was a big issue of imbalanced sex ratio. And this was particularly problematic in Ukraine. Yes, so what you have is very, very few men and then lots of women, relatively speaking. So they thought that in order to increase the birth rate or accelerate the birth rate, they needed to make sure that women who are in marriages, who could marry, will have large families. And women who could not get married because they couldn't have partners, married partners, would also give birth to post-war children. So how did they encourage this? This was technically a little bit complex measures, but in one word, if I don't know if we should get into real details here. You should tell me, please, to what extent I should explain the details of this. But essentially, the idea was to eliminate the kind of obstacles biological fathers of out-of-wedlock births would have. I mean, the obstacles for men to consider having out-of-wedlock children. So first, what happened was that marriage was only registered marriage was made legal by the 1944 family law, which was not the case until then in the pre-war period. Both registered marriages and civil marriages were equally treated by the law, but that changed. And then what also happened in this law was that out-of-wedlock children would not be able to register his or her father's name in the birth certificate. So if you're a father of an out-of-wedlock child, he had no legal responsibility for this child. And what happened next in this law was that mothers, unmarried mothers who raised their children, out-of-wedlock children, lost the right to receive child support from the biological fathers. This meant that biological fathers had no economic responsibilities for supporting their out-of-wedlock children. So this meant that biological fathers of out-of-wedlock children, after the introduction of this family law, will have zero responsibilities for these children. And that was the way to encourage increased number of out-of-wedlock births.
Yeah, this sounds like a decision of questionable morality and questionable, actually, pragmatism. But I would like you to maybe, you said technically it was complicated, but any person should have a birth certificate. And of course, same is true of the Soviet Union. So what happened to just to give an idea to the listener of what it meant, I mean, legalizing out-of-wedlock children without actually giving them a father, even technically, not just father's support, parental support, but even technically. How was that arranged?
Well, the law said simply that out-of-wedlock children will have a birth certificate where the line where they should have the name of the father will be left blank, or there will be a dash in this section. So literally, they had no fathers.
Mm-hmm.
And this was really, of course, a very traumatic situation for the child and for the mother, usually. And because it's one thing to be considered out of wedlock child, but it's another to really feel that you do not have a father, legal father anywhere.
And it seems that inevitably this would in some way make them second rate. Somebody who does not have a father. The Russian word for dash was procherk. And this procherk in one's birth certificate was like a badge of being second rate that accompanied them through their lives. And I think closer to the end of our conversation, you will talk about the consequences, the social consequences, the consequences for the family in the Soviet Union. Now, so apart from this very peculiar policy, and by the way, do you know of any other instances in the world experience of a government seeking to promote birth rate and to solve its demographic problem by encouraging men to actually have irresponsible sex with the women?
I don't know any other cases. Of course, it is possible that in some government historically had this type of discussion. It is possible, but to my knowledge, I have never seen this kind of case anywhere else. But one thing I wanted to add about out of wedlock children, and it's more of a cultural issue, but as you know, obviously, but perhaps not the listeners know, Russian names consist of 3 parts. And so you have a given name, and then in the middle, your middle name is called patronymic. And then you have a last name. And patronymic, your middle name, comes from your biological, it should be coming from your father's first name. So when 1944 family law deprived out of wedlock children from having father's name completely, so what happened to this was that the mother, the unmarried mother, had the full right to create patronymic of her choice. But culturally, of course, this is a very difficult thing because your name should have your father's name also. But if you think that the name came from nowhere, no legal father's name, of course, culturally, this is a real big issue.
Of course, and single mothers are not a uniquely Russian phenomenon or Soviet phenomenon. Of course not. This exists in any country, but at least a woman has the ability to tell her child a story about the man in her life who happened to be her child's father. But with this policy, this was not even possible. That man was not bearing any responsibility, and he was not a father. Only biologically was he a father, but in no other way. And he was somehow encouraged by the government, right, to feel fully irresponsible for his progeny.
Exactly. Yes. But if I may mention, there were fathers who wanted to take the responsibility. I do not go into this group of fathers very much in my book, but there were some minority of men who wanted to be the legal father of these children, but there was no way for them to give their names as the fathers of these so-called out of wedlock children.
Yeah, and this makes it even more dramatic because, of course, they were also marriages. You do not want, and we do not want in this conversation to create the impression that there were no marriages and no happy marriages after the war, and women, of course, gave birth to children. But this category And I think one more question about this policy that I'm going to ask you. So there were those children who had fathers, but for all practical purposes did not. Do you have an assessment of how many of these fatherless children, out of wedlock children, children with a dash, with a прочерк in their birth certificates, were born in the Soviet Union?
Yes, I tried to really, find the numbers that were recorded by the statistical administration, and so I have my own numbers. So for the period between 1945 and 54, the number amounted 8.7 million out of wedlock children who didn't have the name of the father on their birth certificate. And my estimate for the period between 1945 and 68 is about 15 million. And this number has been more recently confirmed by Israeli and Soviet-trained Israeli demographer Mark Tolz. He also estimated about he wrote over 15 million as well.
Yeah, that's a shocking number. So the law that introduced this bizarre and it seems a more immoral measure had other provisions that I would like you to talk about. There were certain bans, there were certain restrictions imposed on the Soviet population at the time. So what were other provisions of the law and other consequences?
So this law involved couple of different elements, as you mentioned, and one of them was to make divorce harder to obtain. And in the pre-war period, in 1936, divorce became a procedure that required court cases, but relatively speaking, it was easy to obtain. But in the post-war period, a new system was introduced where one had to go through two court systems. So the 1944 made divorce very difficult to obtain, involving a number of procedures. First, you had to publish your desire to divorce and your filing of the divorce case at the court. You had to go through 2 layers of court systems and then pay very high fees. And what this did was that divorce was essentially made very difficult to, or impossible for many people to obtain. So people simply stopped even trying to get a legal divorce. So it's one of the elements of the 1944 family law and impact on marriage and divorce. Another element is that this law introduced the idea, or tried anyway, to introduce the idea that reproduction is a civic responsibility. They wanted to inculcate the idea that every adult citizen should have more than 3 children, the magic number 3, which would really assure an increase in the population. Because if everybody had 2, he or she's just replacing themselves. But if you have 3 children, you are participating in the increase of the population. And in order to do so, they introduced a penalty for people who did not have 3 children. So if you had no child, or 1 child, or 2 children, you now had to pay taxes. But if you had more than 3, so starting with the 3rd child, you'll start receiving some level of government support. And the amount increased depending on the number of child you had.
Right. But there were also fines, right, for those, for instance, for those people who had no children. And this was apparently regardless of the reason of why they did not have children. Is that correct?
Yes, well, there are some exceptions, such as soldiers on active duty. They were exempted. So there were some categories of people, but small number.
What were the consequences of this demographic engineering, if I may put it this way? Because at the end of the day, it seems that the rationale was to increase the workforce. It was the Soviet government was in dire need of increasing the workforce to make up for the losses of the war. Something that you spoke about earlier, and something that I think is the meaning of the title of your book, Replacing the Dead. But what was the result of this policy, some of which looks totally bizarre on top of being immoral? What is the result? What happens to the birth rate in the Soviet Union following the 1944 family law?
So there's no evidence that suggests that the policy really succeeded in accelerating the birth rate in the post-war period, as far as I can tell. Well, I'm not a trained demographer. So, I have been discussing this with real demographers, but nobody has said so far that it was successful. So I am confident that in terms of raising or accelerating the birth rate, this policy failed. So that's the first thing I would like to say on this. So what kinds of other consequences did it have? We talked about 15 million out of wedlock children being born who were truly fatherless, were not allowed to have the name of their legal fathers. This massive number of children who lived in post-war period being treated as if they are second-rate citizens. And I have stories of how they were discriminated against at different levels. And it was always a very difficult fact for the mothers as well. I argue really impacted the quality of lives of many, many mothers and children. And I also argue, though, as the result of so many children being born as out of wedlock children, so many women raised children alone, this phenomenon really normalized the idea of women raising children alone in the Soviet Union, I think, for a long time. And in fact, women really were able to do this. They raised children beautifully, many of them. And so there was some kind of confidence among women in their ability to do this alone. But this actually phenomenon, I have to say, was something that was not intended or desired by the policymakers of the 44 family law. So this was an unexpected impact of this law.
I see. So let us get back before we talk about the other aspect of your work, what women lawyers and women doctors were doing at the time, how they tried to change this policy or soften this policy. Let's get back to the issue of abortion. So all through this the implementation of the 1944 family law, abortions were still strictly banned. So what is the impact of that? And you probably have some idea as to with abortions being basically the only method to control the fertility rate in a country that was suffering terribly after the war, was devastated, was impoverished. So what was happening to the abortion rate, and how important the factor of abortion in the absence of contraceptive means, actually? How did it affect?
Yes, I wanted to add, in answering your previous question, that another consequence of the 1944 family law was that it really caused more abortions. Yes, it really forced more women to go into abortions, is what I argue in my book, with, I believe, a lot of evidence. So what happened was that many women in the post-war period, as you say, were facing very difficult life. And many of them really wanted to avoid giving birth, particularly to children who would become out of wedlock. Mostly women wanted to give birth when they thought that children can become, children can have legal father's name. So they wanted to avoid becoming single mothers. So what did they do? Of course, they tried to get an abortion. So that was one of the reasons that the number of abortions rose dramatically in the post-war period. And I have a couple of very important evidence from surveys that were conducted in the post-war period by medical professionals, where they asked women questions about why they underwent illegal abortion. In this period, typically they named two things: bad relationship with the partner, and also material conditions. So when women thought that the relationship with the partner was not ideal, and typically it was that their marriage was not registered, they often chose to terminate their pregnancies. Counterintuitively, this law also affected married women. So we would think, or the policymakers would have thought that married women would be happy to give birth in the post-war period. However, what I discovered in my research was that many married women also underwent abortions for different reasons. But again, for them, not only material conditions, but also not stable relationship with their husbands was the reason. Because when married women saw that their husbands were having relationships with other women, and or their husband had already left and started forming a new partnership, new family, they also wanted to terminate their pregnancies. So actually, this policy affected both married and unmarried women, and contributed to the rise of abortions in the post-war period.
Do you have a sense, or maybe there is statistics to this effect, of how many abortions per women were there in this period in the Soviet Union?
The statistics, the exact numbers of abortions in this period during the criminalized abortion period is not available. Demographers often quote the number 4 on average in this period, 4 abortions in this period.
Very, very high number, given the, in comparison. This remained, not only, as you write in the book, I think, not only the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Russia, but other post-Soviet countries still have a very high rate of abortion comparatively in the world as a legacy of those times, even though, of course, policy has changed quite dramatically since Stalin's family law in 1944. But you mentioned surveys done by people in the medical profession, which logically takes us to the question of what were the doctors doing at the time? Because you write in the book that doctors played a role, and doctors realized just how ruinous, how deleterious this policy was. So what could they do? What were they doing? And who were those women?
Medical doctors, first I would like to mention that medical doctors in the Soviet Union were not predominantly necessarily, but depending on the level of the profession, but there were many of them were women. So I was seeing a lot of female doctors discussing abortion issues in this period. And doctors were put in a very difficult position politically because they were tasked by the government to really stop women from going into abortion. However, professionally, it's very clear that they were trying to expand the opportunity for women to have safe abortion in this period. And so I'm seeing doctors trying to move towards that direction. In this period, in 1951, they succeed in expanding the criteria to qualify medical abortion. And they constantly have how it is more important for women to have access to safe abortion and so forth. But interestingly, sometime around 1954 to 1955, doctors start saying that it's not only the health issue, but it's about women's right to control their fertility. And based on that, doctors started discussing how they need to legalize abortion.
So it's interesting that you were saying that in 1920, of course, the Soviet Union was ahead of everybody else by decades in legalizing abortion. But in 55, it was still fairly early by Western standards, by the standards of Western countries, to speak about legalizing abortion. So once again, the Soviet Union, in a way, was ahead. And for those women early on, I think they had to be very cautious because they were speaking against the government's policy. So when did this policy actually change?
The policy changed in 1955. Which was a very interesting period because it was after the death of Joseph Stalin. He died in 1953. And the next leadership, came in. And as you know, the next Soviet leader was Nikita Khrushchev, the person who initially introduced this pronatalist policy. But in 55, he had not consolidated his power at this moment. So this was politically a little bit fluid time where some interesting development could happen. And the Minister of Health at that time, who was a woman, who was the only Minister of Health in the Soviet Union. Her name is Maria Kovrigina, who took the initiative to really legalize abortion with the conviction that women had the right to decide the timing of motherhood.
Right. And apparently in the 1955 law, it was not only to re-legalize abortion, but also all those bizarre and immoral measures were softened or abolished, right? The out-of-wedlock children were no longer encouraged, and maybe the divorce grew easier. I mean, what were the changes? Because the time, as you said, it was a really interesting and unusual time in the Soviet Union, called, of course, referred to as the thaw. So everything becoming softer in quite a few aspects of the Soviet life. So how did it affect the reproductive policy, if you like, except for re-legalizing abortion?
Well, actually, yes. Of course, this was the thaw period, and re-legalizing abortion nicely fits into the thaw paradigm, in fact. But very interestingly, in terms of divorce law, nothing really changed in this period. Divorce law became easier. I mean, it was amended in 1965. It took 10 years. Yes. So that was not affected by the thaw. And also the question of out-of-wedlock children not being able to have the father's name also didn't change in this period, despite the fact that there were some reform movements, reform campaigns that were initiated a couple of times. This part of amendment didn't happen until 1968. So during the time of Khrushchev, the only real change that happened was re-legalization of abortion. But the rest of the issues that I discuss, which are the part of the 44 law, didn't change until after the ouster of Khrushchev.
And when was it that a woman had the right to put in her child's father's name, the biological father's name, in the birth certificate, when it was not mandatory to have a dash unless a woman was married?
So that was 1968. Mothers were allowed to put some name as the father of the out-of-wedlock child. But that did not mean that they were always putting the biological father's name, because only the fathers who really recognize paternity voluntarily, that means, could really put his name. In 68, there came a possibility to go to the court to establish paternity for mothers, single mothers, to establish paternity. But it was very, very difficult to do. The requirement was very complex, so it was very difficult to establish paternity through the court. So practically, it was usually the case when the fathers wanted to establish paternity, they could put their name, their real names, as the father's name.
But other than that, would you agree that this male irresponsibility was still encouraged, or at least not strongly discouraged?
I completely agree that even with this legal change, the government was still sort of leaving the room for men to get away with irresponsible fatherhood, because it was really voluntary decision for men to recognize paternity after 1968. And when they didn't want to recognize, they didn't.
Indeed. Before we get to a later period, I would like you to say a few words about contraception, because the situation in the late Soviet Union, the time that I remember very well myself, certainly not the 40s or the 50s, but after 68 for sure. So abortion was legal. and abortion was a common, actually the main practice of controlling fertility. But what about contraceptives, and what was wrong with that in the Soviet Union? And maybe do you have a theory as to why?
Well, when the doctors were discussing re-legalizing abortion around 55, there was also a discussion among them of how it is crucial to develop effective modern contraception and make them available to women. And so after the re-legalization, there was actually an encouragement within the medical profession to do more research on contraception. So that continued for more than a decade. So the late 1950s into 60s, there was a lot of research done on contraceptives, but that was not connected to the production of contraception. And that was a political decision. And because the Soviet Union was a planned economy, demand does not determine how much of anything was produced. There was always politics involved in deciding what should be produced, how much. And so the amount and the quality of contraception and the production of contraception was not growing at the same pace as the research was developing in this period. And then in the 1970s, there was a new concern for declining birth rate. And I think because of that, yes, that was the big reason for politics to get involved in the production and development of modern contraceptives, in particular, oral contraception. And in 1974, the Ministry of Health made a long list of indication for oral contraceptives, which made this method practically inaccessible for most women in the Soviet Union.
I remember it very well from my young years, that doctors would tell you that oral contraceptives are bad for you. And actually, how do you know whether this is true or not? And many young women believed it and thought that it was unhealthy for them, that this would lead to infertility, they would be unable to have children later in life, before they're married, or before they're even married, but before they're ready to have children. They want to take oral contraceptives, but then they're told, no, it's not good for you. It's unhealthy. It can ruin your life. And women, of course, believed it. So it was indeed a very serious problem. But essentially, what you're saying, the policy continued to be pronatalist, right? It was, even in that period, much freer period, it still continued to be pronatalist. And the government was quite clearly guided, first and foremost, by pronatalist goals. So would you say this lasted until the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, pronatalist policy was very important in the 1970s. And at this time, there was a big debate about how to somehow encourage the citizens to have more children. And that had a big impact on the educational policy, especially in the European part of the Soviet Union. And there was a very lively discussion of how the government should encourage boys to be like real boys and girls to be real girls, and especially girls should be encouraged to have big families. And so already in this period, the emphasis on the traditional gender role as a solution to regaining higher birth rate began.
Indeed. So we had this brief period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but now, and I would now get back as we wrap up this conversation back to where I started. These days, we are once again in Russia down to a pronatalist policy. And this at a time when a very small cohort of people entering the reproductive age and the workforce age is I mean, I'm talking about people who are born in 2000 and shortly afterward. So this cohort is entering the labor market and the reproductive age, and this is also the time when Russia is waging a war, and many young people are being lost. And probably not surprisingly, in a quite recognizable fashion, the government once again is waging a very forceful pronatalist policy. So my very last question to you, because apparently you look into these matters not only with respect to Russia, but also other countries, can pronatalist policy actually achieve the goal that it sets?
I think I've been reading about pronatalist policies around the world, and my understanding is that it's really, really difficult to come up with a policy that can actually raise fertility. And so in that regard, that perhaps we don't really know whether any government can come up with effective policy. But it is very clear that policies that don't consider real well-being of women in particular, but families in general, in the long run, can never work. So this kind of short-sighted policies that we saw in the post-war period in the Soviet Union of somehow trying to accelerate the birth rate by giving incentive for men to father more children would never work. That's for sure. And also, what we can say is that criminalizing abortion and really restricting women's access to fertility control completely never works. Those two things, I think, are very much confirmed by various studies.
Yeah, and indeed, in your book, there is excellent evidence collected to prove this point. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.